Tab 1, I discovered my wife had sold $350,000 of my stocks behind my back on a Tuesday morning that started like any other. The notification from my brokerage app appeared on my phone at 7:43 a.m., just as I was pouring my second cup of coffee. At first, I thought it was a mistake, a glitch in the system, the kind of thing that happens when servers crash or updates go wrong. But the numbers were too specific, too precise to be random. Sale confirmed, 8,750 shares of Microsoft. Sale confirmed, 12,500 shares of Apple. Sale confirmed, 15,000 shares of Tesla. The list went on, each line representing years of careful planning, disciplined investing, and dreams of early retirement. My name is David Chen, and I've always been methodical about money. Maybe it comes from growing up in a household where my parents counted every penny, where the electricity got shut off twice because they couldn't make ends meet, where dinner sometimes meant splitting a single can of soup between 4 people. I swore I'd never live that way again. So I studied finance, landed a good job at a tech company, and spent 15 years building a portfolio that would give me freedom. Not luxury, not excess, but freedom. The freedom to retire at 55, to travel with my wife Sarah, to maybe start that woodworking business I'd always dreamed about. Sarah knew about the stocks, of course. We'd been married for 12 years, and while I handled most of the investments, I kept her informed. She'd roll her eyes when I got excited about quarterly earnings reports or when I spent Saturday mornings researching emerging markets. "You and your spreadsheets," she'd say, but she'd say it with affection. She understood that this wasn't about greed, this was about security, this was about making sure we never had to worry about money the way my parents did. That Tuesday morning, staring at my phone screen in our kitchen, I felt something break inside my chest. Not my heart exactly, but something deeper. Trust, maybe. The foundation of everything I thought I knew about my marriage. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through the transactions. Each sale had been authorized using my login credentials, which meant Sarah had access to my passwords. She'd logged into my account, navigated through multiple security prompts, and systematically liquidated almost everything I'd spent years building. The kitchen suddenly felt too small, too bright. The morning light streaming through our yellow curtains seemed harsh, exposing every dust mote floating in the air. I could hear Sarah upstairs, getting ready for her job at the nonprofit where she worked as a program coordinator. The sound of the hairdryer, the clatter of jewelry on the dresser, the familiar routine of a marriage that had suddenly become foreign to me. I thought about confronting her immediately, charging up the stairs and demanding an explanation. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the methodical part of my nature asserting itself. Or maybe it was fear. Fear of what I might discover. Fear of what this meant for us. Instead, I called in sick to work and spent the day trying to understand what had happened. The money was gone, transferred to our joint checking account before being withdrawn in several large cashier's checks. The bank records showed the transactions had occurred over the past 3 days, always during hours when I was at work. Sarah had been careful, spacing them out to avoid triggering automatic alerts. She'd planned this. This wasn't an impulse decision or a moment of weakness. This was calculated, deliberate, and thorough. By the time Sarah came home that evening, I'd moved past shock and into something colder. I was sitting at our kitchen table. Printouts of bank statements and brokerage records spread out in front of me like evidence at a crime scene. She walked in the front door, calling out her usual, "Hey, honey, I'm home," and I could hear her footsteps pause when she reached the kitchen doorway. "David?" Her voice was different, smaller. "What's all this?" I looked up at her. This woman I'd shared a bed with for 12 years, whose morning breath I'd grown accustomed to, whose favorite coffee order I knew by heart, whose dreams and fears I thought I understood completely. She was still wearing her work clothes, a navy blue dress with small white flowers that I'd bought for her birthday 2 years ago. Her dark hair was pulled back in the ponytail she wore when she was stressed, and there were small lines around her eyes that hadn't been there when we first met. $350,000, Sarah. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, too calm and measured. You sold $350,000 of my stocks. She didn't deny it. That's what struck me most in that moment. No shock, no confusion, no protestations of innocence. She just stood there, her purse still, hanging from her shoulder, and nodded slowly. "I can explain," she said. "I hope so. Because right now, I can't think of a single explanation that doesn't end with me calling a lawyer." She winced at that, and for the first time since I'd discovered the transactions, I felt a flicker of the old Sarah, the vulnerable woman who'd cried in my arms when her father died, who'd been so nervous about our wedding that she'd thrown up twice before walking down the aisle. "Can we sit down?" she asked. "Please?" I gestured to the chair across from me, and she settled into it carefully, like someone trying not to disturb a sleeping animal. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The refrigerator hummed. A car drove past outside. Somewhere in the distance, someone was mowing their lawn. "How long have you been planning this?" I finally asked. 6 months. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Maybe longer. I don't know exactly when I first thought about it, but I've been researching for 6 months. Researching what, Sarah? What could possibly require $350,000 that you couldn't tell me about? She took a deep breath, and when she looked up at me, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Do you remember Emma Kowalski?" The name hit me like a physical blow. Emma. Sarah's college roommate, her maid of honor at our wedding, the friend who had been like a sister to her until 5 years ago when Emma had simply vanished from our lives. Sarah had been devastated when Emma cut off all contact. And despite my questions, she'd never really explained what had happened between them. What does Emma have to do with this? "She's in trouble, David. Real trouble. The kind that doesn't go away on its own." Sarah began to tell me a story that sounded like something out of a movie. Emma hadn't disappeared by choice 5 years ago. She'd been running from her ex-husband, Marcus, a man who Sarah described as charming on the surface but controlling and violent underneath. Emma had tried to leave him multiple times, but each time he'd found her, convinced her to come back, promised to change. The final time she'd tried to leave, he'd beaten her so badly that she'd spent 3 days in the hospital. "She couldn't go to the police," Sarah continued, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. "Marcus has connections. His brother is a detective, his uncle is a judge. Emma tried once to file a restraining order, and it disappeared from the system. She tried to press charges, and the prosecutor said there wasn't enough evidence." According to Sarah, Emma had made the desperate decision to fake her own death. With the help of someone Marcus couldn't reach or intimidate, she'd staged a car accident, complete with blood evidence and a suicide note. The authorities had declared her dead after her body was never recovered from the river. For 5 years, she'd been living under a new identity in a small town in Montana, working cash jobs and staying invisible. But Marcus never believed she was dead, Sarah said. He hired private investigators. He's been looking for her all this time, and 3 months ago, one of them found her. The story Sarah told me was harrowing. The private investigator had photographed Emma at her job at a diner in Whitefish, Montana. He'd followed her to the small apartment she rented above a bookstore. He documented her new life, her new name, everything. But instead of reporting back to Marcus immediately, the investigator had done something unexpected. He'd approached Emma directly. "His name is Rick Valdez," Sarah said. "He's a former cop, runs his own investigation business. When he saw how scared Emma was when she told him what Marcus had done to her, what he'd threatened to do if he ever found her, Rick offered to help. Rick's plan was audacious and expensive. He would tell Marcus that he'd found evidence Emma was alive, but that she'd gone deeper underground, possibly overseas. He'd provide false documentation suggesting she'd fled to Europe. Meanwhile, he'd help Emma disappear again, this time more permanently. New identity, not just a fake name, but real documentation. A complete erasure of her current life and the creation of a new one, somewhere Marcus would never think to look. "But it costs money," Sarah said. "A lot of money. New identity documents, travel expenses, setting up a new life in a new place. Rick quoted $350,000 for everything." I stared at my wife, trying to process what she'd just told me. "So you stole from me to fund some elaborate witness protection scheme for a woman who's been dead to us for 5 years? "She's not dead to me," Sarah's voice cracked. "She's my best friend, David. She was my maid of honor. She held my hand when my mom was dying. I can't just abandon her. But you can abandon me. You can steal everything we've built together without even discussing it." I knew you'd say no. The words hung between us like a challenge. I wanted to deny it, to insist that I would have been reasonable, that we could have found another way. But she was probably right. I would have said no. I would have pointed out the risks, the lack of guarantees, the possibility that this Rick person was running a con. I would have suggested alternatives, going to the FBI, hiring our own lawyer, finding a way to expose Marcus through legitimate channels. You're right, I said finally. I would have said no, because this is insane, Sarah. You've given our entire future to a stranger based on a story you can't verify. I've been talking to Emma for months, Sarah said. Video calls, always from different locations. She's terrified, David. She can barely sleep. She jumps at every sound. Marcus is closing in, and if he finds her, then she should go to the FBI. There are legitimate ways to handle this. Are there? Marcus has money, connections, patience. Emma tried the legitimate ways, and they failed. This is her only chance. We argued for hours that night. I demanded proof, documentation, some way to verify that this elaborate story wasn't an elaborate con. Sarah showed me encrypted messages, photos of Emma looking gaunt and scared, even a brief video call where I could see the terror in Emma's eyes as she described her situation. But none of it felt real to me. It felt like theater, like something staged to manipulate us. The money was already gone, transferred to Rick Valdez through a series of transactions designed to be difficult to trace. Sarah had the account numbers, the contact information, but when I tried to reach Rick myself, his phone went to voicemail and my emails bounced back. According to Sarah, this was part of his security protocol. He only communicated through encrypted channels at predetermined times. What if this is all fake? I asked her as we sat in our darkened living room at midnight, both of us exhausted from arguing. What if someone figured out your connection to Emma and decided to run a long con? What if the woman you've been talking to isn't even Emma? It's her, Sarah said with a certainty that scared me. I know her voice, her mannerisms, the way she laughs. It's her, David. But I could see doubt creeping in around the edges of her conviction. She'd been so focused on helping Emma that she hadn't allowed herself to question the situation critically. Now, faced with my skepticism and the reality of what she'd done, she was starting to waver. Over the next few days, our marriage became a cold war. We spoke only when necessary, passed each other in the hallways of our own home like strangers. I slept in the guest room and spent my days trying to figure out if there was any way to recover the money. I consulted with lawyers, filed reports with the appropriate authorities, and spent hours on the phone with fraud investigators. But the trail was complex and international, designed by someone who knew how to make money disappear. Sarah threw herself into her work, staying late at the nonprofit and coming home exhausted. But I could see the weight of what she'd done pressing down on her. She'd lost weight, developed dark circles under her eyes, and had started talking in her sleep, muttering apologies and reassurances to someone I couldn't see. A week after our confrontation, she came home with new information. Rick had made contact with specific details about the next phase of the operation. Emma was going to be moved to a safe house while her new documents were prepared. The process would take 6 weeks, and then she'd vanish forever. Sarah showed me an encrypted message that included a photo of Emma in what looked like a hotel room, holding a newspaper with that day's date. "This proves she's alive," Sarah said, hope creeping back into her voice. "This proves it's real." But the photo only made me more suspicious. Emma looked different, thinner and older than I remembered, but also wrong somehow. Her smile seemed forced, her eyes vacant in a way that suggested drugs or coercion rather than relief. "What if they're holding her against her will?" I asked. "What if this Rick person is the real threat?" Sarah stared at the photo for a long time before answering. "Then we need to find out." That night, we had our first real conversation since the discovery of the stolen money. Sarah admitted that she'd been having doubts, that some of Rick's requests had seemed strange, that the timeline kept shifting in ways that made her uncomfortable. She'd been so desperate to help Emma that she'd ignored her instincts. "I need to see her," Sarah said, "face to face. I need to know for sure." Rick's instructions had been clear. No contact beyond the encrypted messages, no attempts to track or locate Emma during the transition period. But Sarah was past caring about his rules. She'd found ways to research Rick's business, and what she'd discovered was troubling. His investigative license had been suspended 2 years ago for ethics violations. His business address was a mail drop. The testimonials on his website were generic and potentially fake. We spent the weekend playing detective, using resources I'd never known existed, public records, social media forensics, Reverse image searches. Slowly, a different picture began to emerge. Rick Valdez was real, but he was also desperate. His business was failing. He owed money to dangerous people, and he'd been running increasingly elaborate scams to stay afloat. The woman in the photos was Emma. We confirmed that much through facial recognition software, but the locations were wrong. The metadata from the images, when we figured out how to extract it, showed they'd been taken in Nevada, not Montana. The story about Marcus and his connections started to fall apart when we dug deeper. Emma's ex-husband existed, but he was remarried and living in Florida, apparently having moved on with his life years ago. "She's not running from Marcus," I said as we sat surrounded by printouts and laptop screens. "She's working with Rick to scam us." Sarah's face went through a series of emotions: denial, anger, heartbreak, and finally, a terrible understanding. "The Emma I knew would never do this," she whispered. "People change," I said, and immediately regretted the harshness in my voice. "I'm sorry. I know how much she meant to you." But Sarah was staring at one of the photos with a strange expression. "No," she said slowly. "Look at her eyes. Really look." I looked. In every photo, Emma's expression was slightly off, her smile too bright, her posture too rigid. There was something desperate in her face, something that spoke of fear rather than greed. "What if Rick is forcing her to do this?" Sarah asked. "What if she's as much a victim as we are?" It was possible. If Rick had found Emma living quietly under a false identity, he'd have tremendous leverage over her. He could threaten to expose her location, to reveal her fake death to authorities, to destroy the life she'd built. A desperate man with that kind of power could force someone into almost anything. We made a decision that night that probably saved Emma's life, though we didn't know it at the time. We decided to go to Nevada and find her ourselves despite the risks, despite Rick's warnings about interfering with the operation. Sarah's logic was simple. If Emma was a willing participant in the scam, we'd confront her and try to recover what we could. If she was being coerced, we'd try to help her. The drive to Nevada took 2 days. We'd traced the photo metadata to a small town called Beatty. Population less than 1,000, the kind of place where strangers stick out and everyone knows everyone else's business. We checked into the only motel in town and began asking careful questions. The desk clerk at the motel recognized Emma from the photo we showed him. "She's staying at the Eclipse Inn," he said. "Been there about 3 weeks with some guy. Keeps to herself mostly, but she always looks scared when he's around." The Eclipse Inn was more of a long-term residential motel than a tourist destination, the kind of place people stayed when they were between apartments or running from something. We found Emma's room number by following the sound of voices through thin walls. Sarah knocked softly, calling Emma's name. The door opened a crack, revealing Emma's face, and I saw Sarah's composure completely crumble. This was definitely her college roommate, but Emma looked like she'd aged 20 years in the 5 since they'd last seen each other. She was gaunt, almost skeletal, with the hollow-eyed look of someone living on stress and fear. When she saw Sarah, she started crying. "You shouldn't be here," Emma whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "Rick said no contact, if he finds out." "Emma, what's happening? Are you okay?" Emma's story, told in hushed whispers in her dingy motel room while Rick was supposedly out getting food, was heartbreaking. She had faked her death 5 years ago, but not to escape an abusive husband. She'd been running from drug debts, from people who'd threatened her family if she didn't pay what she owed. The fake death had been her idea. But she'd done it wrong, left too many traces. Rick had found her 2 years ago, and had been systematically bleeding her dry ever since. "He knows about my family," Emma said, her hands shaking as she spoke. "My parents, my sister. He has their addresses, photos of them going about their daily lives. He says if I don't do what he tells me, if I don't help him with his projects, he'll tell everyone I'm alive and that my family helped me fake my death." Rick had been using Emma to run romance scams, investment frauds, and other cons that required a sympathetic female face. The story about Marcus, about needing money for new identity documents, had been his idea. He'd researched Sarah's background, learned about her successful marriage, and her husband's investment portfolio, and crafted a story designed to exploit Sarah's love for her old friend. "I told him you'd never fall for it," Emma said, looking at Sarah with anguished eyes. I told him you were too smart, that David would see through it. But he said if I didn't try, if I didn't make it convincing, he'd hurt my parents. The worst part was that Emma had been trying to sabotage the scam from the beginning. The forced smiles in the photos, the slightly off details in her messages, the way she'd looked directly into the camera with that desperate expression. She'd been trying to signal that something was wrong without being so obvious that Rick would notice. I hoped you'd see it, she said to Sarah. I hoped you'd realize something wasn't right and stay away. But when the money came through, when Rick showed me the bank transfers, I knew I'd failed you again. We were still talking when we heard Rick's key in the door. Emma's eyes went wide with terror, and she gestured frantically for us to hide, but there was nowhere to go in the small room. The door opened, and Rick Valdez walked in carrying a bag of fast food and a six-pack of beer. He was not what I'd expected. Shorter than me, probably in his mid-50s, with graying hair and the soft build of someone who spent more time behind a desk than in the field. He looked like an accountant or a middle manager, not a criminal mastermind. But when he saw us, his entire demeanor changed. The mild-mannered facade dropped away, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. Well, well, he said, setting down the food and beer with deliberate calm. The happy couple decides to take a vacation. How romantic. Let her go, I said, moving slightly in front of Sarah. Whatever you think you're accomplishing here, it ends now. Rick laughed, a sound devoid of humor. Let her go, friend. You've got this all wrong. Emma here is my business partner. She's been helping me run a very successful operation, and your wife just funded our biggest score yet. Emma, why don't you tell them how much you've enjoyed working with me? Emma was pressed against the far wall, as far from Rick as the small room would allow. Please, she whispered, just let them leave. They don't know anything. Oh, but they do know something, Rick said. They know that Emma Kowalski isn't dead. They know she's been running cons. They know about our whole operation. That's valuable information, and I can't let it walk out of here. The room felt smaller and smaller as Rick moved closer. He hadn't explicitly threatened us, but the implication was clear. We knew too much to be allowed to leave freely. I found myself calculating distances, wondering if I could reach him before he could reach whatever weapon he might be carrying. What do you want? Sarah asked, her voice steadier than I felt. Smart question, Rick said. I want my operation to continue. I want Emma to keep being profitable, and I want you two to become profitable too. He outlined his proposal with the casual tone of someone discussing a business merger. We would become part of his network, using our legitimate backgrounds and clean records to help run more sophisticated scams. Sarah's nonprofit connections, my finance background, our middle-class respectability, all valuable assets in the right kind of confidence game. You've already proven you can access significant funds quickly and quietly, he said. That's a useful skill set. And now that you're here, now that you know about Emma, you're either with me or you're a liability. The threat was implicit but unmistakable. Emma was crying silently, her face a mask of guilt and terror. I could see that she blamed herself for bringing us into this, for not finding a way to warn us off more effectively. What happened next unfolded so quickly that I'm still not entirely sure of the sequence of events. Sarah had been standing near the door, and when Rick turned slightly to gesture at Emma, she bolted. Just ran for the door, yanked it open, and started screaming for help at the top of her lungs. Rick lunged after her, and I tackled him, both of us crashing into the small table that held the room's television. Emma was yelling something, but I couldn't make out the words over the sound of Rick cursing and trying to throw me off of him. He was stronger than he looked, and meaner, throwing elbows and trying to gouge at my eyes. By the time the motel manager and two other guests had responded to Sarah's screams, Rick and I were both bloody, and Emma had locked herself in the bathroom. The local sheriff's deputy arrived within minutes. Apparently Sarah had had the presence of mind to scream that someone was being held against their will, which got faster response than a simple domestic disturbance might have. The deputy was a weathered woman in her 50s, who looked like she'd seen every kind of trouble that could happen in a small desert town. She separated us, called for backup, and began the process of sorting out what was happening. Rick immediately started spinning a story about Emma being his girlfriend, about us being disgruntled relatives trying to interfere in their relationship. But Emma had reached her breaking point. When the deputy coaxed her out of the bathroom and began asking questions, she broke down and told the truth. All of it. The fake death, the years of being blackmailed, the scams she'd been forced to participate in, everything. She had documentation hidden in her suitcase, copies of messages and photos that Rick had sent her family, evidence of the other cons he was running. The investigation that followed took months and involved law enforcement agencies in 3 states. Rick Valdez, it turned out, was wanted for multiple fraud charges and had been using Emma as the face of his operations for nearly 2 years. Other victims came forward, people who'd been scammed out of retirement funds, savings accounts, insurance settlements. The total damage was well over $1 million. Emma agreed to testify against Rick in exchange for immunity from prosecution for her role in the scams. The prosecutor acknowledged that she'd been coerced and that her cooperation was essential to building the case against Rick. As for our money, some of it was recoverable from accounts Rick hadn't had time to empty, but most was gone, spent on his gambling debts and lifestyle. Sarah and I returned home to face the wreckage of our financial future. The $350,000 had represented more than half of our total investments, money I'd planned to use for early retirement, for the woodworking business, for all the dreams we'd built together. Now, at 42 and 38 respectively, we were starting over financially. The marriage counseling started 3 weeks after we returned from Nevada. Dr. Rebecca Martinez was a specialist in relationships damaged by betrayal, and she didn't pull punches. In our first session, she asked Sarah a question that neither of us had considered. Why didn't you trust your husband enough to tell him about Emma's situation? Sarah's answer revealed layers of our relationship that I hadn't understood. She'd always seen me as practical to the point of coldness, someone who made decisions based on spreadsheets and risk assessments rather than emotion or loyalty. She'd believed that I would have reduced Emma's situation to numbers and probabilities, that I would have dismissed the emotional component of her desire to help her friend. David sees problems as puzzles to be solved, Sarah told Dr. Martinez, but Emma wasn't a puzzle. She was a person I loved who was in pain. I didn't think David would understand that. Dr. Martinez turned to me. How do you respond to that? I had to think for a long time before answering. I think Sarah might be right, I said finally. Not about not understanding, but about how I approach problems. I probably would have wanted to find a different solution, a safer one, but I also would have wanted to help Emma if I'd known she was in real danger. The sessions were brutal and enlightening. We dissected our communication patterns, our assumptions about each other, the ways we'd failed to be truly vulnerable in our 12 years together. Sarah had to acknowledge that her decision to steal from me was a fundamental betrayal of trust, regardless of her motivations. I had to acknowledge that my approach to problems sometimes made Sarah feel like her emotions were inconvenient variables to be managed, rather than valid concerns to be addressed. Emma's situation cast a long shadow over our recovery process. She'd been relocated by federal marshals as part of her witness protection agreement, living under a new identity until Rick's trial concluded. Sarah worried about her constantly, feeling responsible for Emma's years of suffering and guilty about her role in bringing us into Rick's web. I should have known, Sarah would say during our sessions. I should have realized something was wrong. Rick was a professional manipulator, Dr. Martinez would remind her. He'd been doing this for years. He knew exactly how to exploit your love for Emma and your desire to help. The trial, when it finally happened 8 months later, was a media circus. Rick had been charged with multiple counts of fraud, extortion, and racketeering. The prosecution painted him as a predator who specialized in finding vulnerable people and exploiting their connections to others. Emma's testimony was devastating, delivered in a clear, steady voice that belied the trauma she'd experienced. Sarah and I testified about our experience, about the sophisticated nature of the scam, and the way Rick had researched our backgrounds to craft the perfect manipulation. The defense tried to paint us as willing participants, arguing that no reasonable person would have transferred such a large sum without due diligence. But the evidence of Rick's coercion, of Emma's desperate attempts to signal for help, was overwhelming. Rick was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. The judge, in delivering the sentence, noted the particularly cruel nature of the defendant's crimes, which exploited not only his victims' financial resources, but their deepest emotional bonds. Some of our money was recovered through asset forfeiture, about $80,000, that Rick hadn't had time to spend or hide. It wasn't much compared to what we'd lost, but it felt like a moral victory. More importantly, Emma was finally free. The day after Rick's sentencing, Sarah received a letter forwarded through the Victim Services Coordinator. It was from Emma, written in her familiar handwriting on plain paper. The letter was short but profound. Sarah, I can never apologize enough for what I put you and David through. I know that Rick forced me to do it, but I also know that doesn't undo the damage. You lost your savings because of me, and you almost lost each other. I think about that every day. I want you to know that I'm safe now, that I'm getting help, and that I'm trying to build a life that honors the sacrifice you made for me. I hope someday you can forgive me. I hope someday I can forgive myself. Love always, E. Sarah cried when she read it, but they were different tears than she'd shed during the dark months after Nevada. These were tears of relief, of closure, of finally knowing that her friend was going to be okay. Our financial recovery took longer. We had to abandon the dream of early retirement and adjust to a more modest lifestyle. I took on consulting work in addition to my regular job, and Sarah applied for a promotion at her nonprofit. We sold the house and moved to a smaller place, using the equity to rebuild our emergency fund. But something unexpected happened during those lean years. We got closer. The shared struggle, the necessity of communicating clearly about money and goals, the humbling experience of starting over in our 40s, it all forced us to develop new intimacy. We learned to have conversations we'd avoided for years, to share fears and dreams we'd kept private. I think we needed this, Sarah said one evening as we sat in our smaller living room reviewing budget spreadsheets on my laptop. Not the trauma, not losing Emma, but this process of rebuilding together. I looked around our modest apartment at the secondhand furniture and the careful organization that came from having less space and realized she was right. We'd been living parallel lives before, successful and comfortable, but not truly connected. Now we were partners in a way we'd never been before. The woodworking business that I'd dreamed about for years became a reality sooner than expected, though not in the way I'd planned. Without the cushion of our investment portfolio, I couldn't afford to quit my day job and start a shop. Instead, I began building furniture in our apartment's storage unit, selling pieces online and at local craft fairs. Sarah helped with the marketing and bookkeeping, and slowly we built a small but steady side business. 2 years after Rick's conviction, we were in a better financial position than we'd been immediately after the theft, though still far from where we'd started. More importantly, we were in a better emotional position. The marriage counseling had evolved into occasional check-ins with Dr. Martinez, and we'd developed tools for communication and conflict resolution that served us well. Emma remained part of our story, but not our daily lives. She sent occasional updates through the victim services coordinator, always brief but reassuring. She'd found work at a library in a small town, was taking night classes to finish her college degree, was seeing a therapist who specialized in trauma recovery. She was building a real life under her new identity, not just surviving, but slowly healing. On the 3rd anniversary of that Tuesday morning when I'd discovered the stolen stocks, Sarah suggested we do something to mark the date. Not a celebration exactly, but an acknowledgement of how far we'd come. What did you have in mind? I asked. I want to visit Emma, she said. I want her to know that we're okay, that we don't blame her, that we're proud of how she's rebuilt her life. It took months to arrange through the proper channels, but eventually we were granted permission for a supervised visit. Emma had agreed to it, according to the coordinator, but was nervous about seeing us again. The meeting took place in a coffee shop in a small town in Oregon, with a federal marshal at a nearby table pretending to read a newspaper. Emma arrived early and was waiting at a corner booth when we walked in. She looked completely different from the terrified woman we'd found in that Nevada motel room. Healthier, calmer, with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from surviving something terrible and coming out the other side. Sarah and Emma's reunion was tentative at first, both of them unsure how to navigate the complex emotions involved, but gradually they fell into something resembling their old friendship, talking about books Emma was reading, classes she was taking, the small victories of building a normal life. I think about you both all the time, Emma said as our visit was winding down. I think about what you sacrificed for me, even when you didn't know you were sacrificing it. I've tried to make that mean something, to make sure the life I'm building is worth what it cost you. It wasn't your fault, Sarah said. Rick manipulated all of us. You were as much a victim as we were. Maybe, Emma said, but I still carry the responsibility. That's something I'm working through in therapy. As we prepared to leave, Emma pulled out a small wrapped package. "I made this," she said, handing it to me. "I remembered Sarah mentioning that you wanted to do woodworking." Inside was a small wooden box, beautifully crafted with dovetail joints, and a finish that brought out the natural grain of the wood. It was clearly the work of someone who understood both the technical and artistic aspects of the craft. "I've been taking classes," Emma explained. "It helps me focus, gives me something constructive to do with my hands. I hoped you might like it." The box was exquisite, better than anything I'd produced in my own woodworking attempts. I turned it over in my hands, appreciating the smooth finish and precise joints. "Emma, this is incredible," I said. "You have real talent." She smiled, the first genuinely happy expression I'd seen from her. "It's therapeutic. There's something about working with wood, about creating something beautiful from something raw, that helps me process everything that happened." The drive home from Oregon was quiet, both Sarah and I lost in our own thoughts. The visit had provided closure in ways I hadn't expected. Seeing Emma healthy and rebuilding her life had lifted a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. Sarah seemed lighter too, as if she'd finally been able to forgive herself for the choices that had led us into Rick's web. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked as we crossed the state line back into California. "Losing all that money, having to start over?" I considered the question carefully. "I regret the betrayal," I said finally. "I regret that you felt you couldn't trust me enough to tell me what was happening, but the money? The restart? I think it might have been the best thing that ever happened to us." She looked surprised. "Really?" "We were living separate lives before, Sarah. You had your work. I had my investments. We had our routines. We were comfortable, but we weren't really connected. Losing everything forced us to figure out what we actually valued, what we were willing to fight for together." That conversation marked a turning point in how we viewed our experience. Instead of seeing it as a tragedy that had befallen us, we began to frame it as a crucible that had strengthened our marriage and clarified our priorities. The woodworking business continued to grow, slowly but steadily. I'd learned techniques from online tutorials and local craftsmen, but Emma's box had inspired me to take a more formal approach to learning the craft. I enrolled in a weekend program at a community college, studying under a master craftsman who taught me not just techniques, but philosophy. "Wood has memory," he told our class during one of his lectures. "It remembers where it grew, how it was cut, how it was treated. Your job as a craftsman is to work with that memory, not against it. The wood will tell you what it wants to become if you listen carefully enough." I thought about that lesson often as I worked on pieces in our small shop. Each piece of wood had its own character, its own grain pattern, its own response to tools and finishes. Learning to read those characteristics, to adapt my designs to what the material could best become, was both humbling and exhilarating. Sarah began helping more actively with the business, not just with bookkeeping, but with design and customer relations. She had an intuitive sense for what customers wanted before they knew it themselves, and she could translate their vague descriptions into specific design requirements that I could execute. "We make a good team," she said one evening as we reviewed orders and planned the next week's production schedule. "I think we always did. We just never applied ourselves to the same project before." Our apartment workshop had grown into a proper rented space, complete with professional tools and a small showroom. We weren't making a fortune, but we were building something together, creating pieces that would outlast us and bring beauty into other people's homes. 4 years after the theft, we received another letter from Emma. This one was different from her previous communications. Longer, more personal, filled with details about her new life. She'd finished her degree, was working as a librarian in a town she'd grown to love, had even started dating someone, a gentleman who worked at the local hardware store and knew nothing of her past. "I've been thinking about identity lately," she wrote. "For so long I defined myself by what I was running from, Marcus, then Rick, then the whole weight of my past mistakes. But I'm starting to understand that identity isn't about your history, it's about your choices. Every day, I choose to be someone who reads to children at the library, who volunteers at the animal shelter, who builds furniture in her spare time and gives pieces to neighbors who can't afford to buy them. Those choices are creating a person I can be proud of." The letter included photos of some of her recent woodworking projects: a dining table, a bookshelf, a a children's toy chest painted in bright colors. Her skill had continued to develop, and her pieces showed both technical proficiency and artistic vision. I want you to know, the letter continued, that the life I'm building is possible because of what you sacrificed for me. I don't mean just the money, though that was part of it. I mean your willingness to see past Rick's manipulation to the person I really was underneath. When you came to Nevada, when you risked your own safety to help me, you reminded me that I was worth saving. That's a gift I carry with me every day. Sarah was quiet for a long time after reading the letter. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful. I used to think that saving Emma meant getting her away from Rick, getting her somewhere safe. But I think the real saving happened when we showed her that she wasn't alone, that people still cared about what happened to her. The 5th anniversary of our financial loss coincided with the opening of our first real showroom. We'd found a space in the arts district of our city, a former auto repair shop that we'd converted into a combination workshop and gallery. The grand opening was a small affair. Friends, family, customers, and a few local business owners who'd supported us during the building process. My parents came, which surprised me. They'd always been skeptical of anything that seemed risky or unconventional, but they walked through our showroom with obvious pride, touching the pieces we'd made and asking detailed questions about our process. You know, my father said as he examined a hand-carved jewelry box, when you lost all that money, your mother and I worried that you'd never recover. We didn't understand that sometimes losing everything is the only way to find out what really matters. Sarah's parents were there too, along with colleagues from her nonprofit and friends we'd made through the business. The atmosphere was celebratory but also reflective. We'd all been through something together, witnessed a kind of transformation that doesn't happen often in ordinary life. Toward the end of the evening, as we were cleaning up and saying goodbye to the last guests, Sarah pulled me aside. I have something for you, she said, producing a small wrapped package. Inside was a photograph, professionally framed. It showed the 3 of us, Sarah, Emma, and me, from that coffee shop meeting in Oregon. I'd forgotten that the federal marshal had offered to take a picture, but apparently Sarah had requested a copy. In the photo, we looked like survivors. Not victims, not people broken by what we'd endured, but individuals who'd been tested and had emerged stronger. Emma looked peaceful in a way I'd never seen before. Sarah looked confident and settled, and I looked content. Not wealthy or successful in the traditional sense, but genuinely satisfied with where I was and who I was with. I wanted you to have this, Sarah said, because I want you to remember this moment. Not just today, but that day in Oregon when we realized that all of us were going to be okay. When we realized that what we'd lost wasn't nearly as important as what we'd found. The showroom opening was successful enough that we started getting orders from interior designers and furniture stores in neighboring cities. The business grew beyond what either of us had imagined possible, not because we were chasing growth, but because we were focused on quality and craftsmanship. We hired our first employee 6 months later, a young woman named Maria who just graduated from art school with a degree in industrial design. She brought fresh perspectives to our work while respecting the handcrafted approach that had become our signature. Teaching her our techniques reminded me of those early lessons from my community college instructor about listening to the wood and working with its natural characteristics. The financial recovery took longer, but by the 7th anniversary of the theft, we'd not only rebuilt our savings, but had created something more valuable. A business that reflected our values and brought us genuine satisfaction. We weren't as wealthy as we might have been if I'd continued climbing the corporate ladder and investing in the stock market, but we were richer in ways that couldn't be measured on a balance sheet. Emma's letters became less frequent but more substantial as the years passed. She'd been promoted to head librarian, had married her hardware store boyfriend in a small ceremony attended by her new community, and had started a program teaching woodworking skills to at-risk youth in her area. I think about parallel lives sometimes, she wrote in one letter. The life I would have lived if I'd never gotten involved with drugs, never accumulated those debts, never had to fake my death. But then I realized that person, the person I would have been, might never have developed the strength I have now, might never have learned to value simple kindness the way I do, might never have discovered that it's possible to rebuild completely and become someone better than who you were before. Her insights about transformation resonated with both Sarah and me. We'd all become different people through our shared trauma and recovery. Not just damaged by what we'd experienced, but deepened by it, more aware of what mattered and what didn't. The business continued to evolve. We started teaching workshops on weekends, sharing our skills with hobbyists and retirees who wanted to learn traditional craftsmanship. The classes became a community gathering point, a place where people could work with their hands and talk about their lives while creating something beautiful. One of our regular students was a man named Robert, recently retired from a career in banking. His story reminded me of my own journey, successful by conventional measures, but feeling empty, looking for something more meaningful to do with his time and skills. I spent 40 years moving money around, he told me during one of our sessions as he worked on a small side table. Making other people richer, optimizing portfolios, calculating risk. But I never made anything real, anything that someone could touch and use and pass down to their children. Watching Robert discover the satisfaction of working with wood, seeing his confidence grow as his skills developed, reinforced my belief that we'd found something valuable in our forced career change. We weren't just running a business. We were providing people with a way to connect with their creativity and their capacity for creating beauty. Sarah's role in the business had evolved too. She'd left her nonprofit job and was now running the business side of our operation full-time, but she'd brought her social justice background with her. We started a program providing free furniture to families transitioning out of homelessness, partnering with local shelters and assistance organizations. Everyone deserves to have something beautiful in their home, Sarah would tell volunteers who helped with the program. Everyone deserves to own something made with care, something that wasn't mass-produced in a factory, but crafted by someone who cared about the quality. The program grew to include job training components, teaching basic woodworking skills to people who needed marketable trades. Several of our trainees went on to find employment with other craftsmen or started their own small operations. We weren't changing the world, but we were changing individual lives in meaningful ways. 8 years after the theft, we received an unexpected visitor. A young woman named Jessica knocked on our showroom door one afternoon, introducing herself as an investigative journalist working on a story about financial fraud. She'd been researching Rick's case and wanted to interview us about our experience. "I'm particularly interested in the recovery aspect," she explained as we sat in our small office area, surrounded by the smell of wood shavings and the sound of sanders running in the workshop. "Most coverage of financial crimes focuses on the initial victimization, but I want to explore what happens afterward, how people rebuild." The interview lasted several hours and covered not just the facts of our case, but the emotional and practical challenges of recovery. Jessica was thorough and empathetic, clearly understanding that financial crime involves more than just money. It damages trust, relationships, and people's sense of security in the world. "What would you want other victims to know?" she asked toward the end of our conversation. Sarah and I looked at each other, and I could see that she was thinking the same thing I was. "That it's possible to rebuild," Sarah said. "Not just financially, but emotionally, that sometimes losing everything forces you to figure out what actually matters to you. And that the person you become after something like this might be someone you like better than who you were before," I added. "Not because trauma is good, but because recovery can teach you things about yourself and your relationships that you might never have learned otherwise." Jessica's article, when it was published several months later, sparked responses from other fraud victims around the country. We received letters and emails from people who'd been through similar experiences, sharing their own stories of loss and recovery. Some asked for advice about starting over. Others just wanted to connect with people who understood what they'd been through. The responses led Sarah to propose something that surprised me: starting a support group for financial fraud victims. "We have the space," she pointed out, gesturing around our showroom. "We have the experience, and clearly there are people who need this kind of community." The support group met monthly on Sunday afternoons, after our woodworking classes had finished for the day. The format was simple. People shared their experiences, discussed practical strategies for recovery, and worked together on small craft projects. The combination of emotional support and creative activity proved powerful. "There's something about making something with your hands while you talk about difficult subjects," observed Dr. Martinez, who'd volunteered to facilitate some of our sessions. "It gives people something to focus on besides their pain, but it also creates a sense of accomplishment and forward movement." Emma's influence on our work was indirect but significant. Her letters often mentioned the therapeutic value of woodworking, the way that creating something beautiful helped her process trauma and build confidence. When we started incorporating craft activities into our support group meetings, we were drawing on insights she'd shared with us over the years. The 10th anniversary of the theft found us in a place I could never have imagined. Our business was thriving, employing 6 people full-time and providing part-time work for several more. Our support group had helped dozens of fraud victims begin their own recovery processes. Our marriage was stronger than it had ever been, built on a foundation of shared struggle and mutual respect that we'd never achieved during our comfortable early years. We marked the anniversary by visiting Emma again, this time in her new hometown where she'd agreed to meet us at a local restaurant. The reunion was warm and natural, like old friends getting together rather than the complicated, emotionally charged meetings of earlier years. Emma looked completely settled in her life. Her marriage was clearly happy, her work at the library was fulfilling, and she'd become a respected member of her community. She showed us photos of the youth woodworking program she'd started, kids from difficult backgrounds learning to channel their energy into creative projects. "I've been thinking about legacy lately," she said as we shared dessert and coffee. Not the legacy of what happened to us, but the legacy of how we responded to what happened, the ripple effects of choosing to rebuild rather than just survive. She was right. The effects of our shared trauma had spread far beyond our individual recoveries. The business we'd built, the support group we'd started, the programs Emma was running, all of it traced back to that terrible Tuesday morning when I'd discovered the stolen stocks. But instead of destruction, that moment had ultimately created connection, community, and purpose. "I used to think that trauma just broke things," Sarah said, "that it damaged people and relationships and left permanent scars. And maybe that's true sometimes, but I think it can also reveal strengths you didn't know you had, force you to develop resilience you never needed before." The conversation turned to the future. Emma was hoping to adopt children, having decided that she wanted to share her stable life with kids who needed the kind of second chance she'd been given. Sarah and I were considering expanding our business, possibly opening a second location, or developing an online component that could reach more people. "Whatever we do next," I said, "I want it to honor what we've learned. About resilience, about community, about the difference between success and fulfillment." As we prepared to part ways, Emma handed us another small package. Inside was a wooden picture frame, beautifully crafted with intricate carved details around the border. It was designed to hold the photograph from our Oregon meeting, the image of the 3 of us as survivors rather than victims. "I made this for your anniversary," she said. "I wanted you to have something to remind you that what we went through, what we lost, what we found, it's all part of the same story, and it's a good story, even with all the difficult parts." The drive home was contemplative. Sarah and I talked about the trajectory of our lives, how impossible it would have been to predict where we'd end up based on where we'd started. The theft that had seemed like the end of everything had actually been the beginning of something better. "Do you think we would have found this path on our own?" Sarah asked. "If Rick had never targeted us? If we'd just continued on the way we were going?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I think we were both restless, looking for something more meaningful, but we might never have been brave enough to make a change without being forced into it." The business had evolved again by this point, incorporating more educational components and community outreach. We'd started partnering with schools to provide arts education, bringing woodworking and furniture making into classrooms, where kids could experience the satisfaction of creating something with their own hands. One of my favorite parts of the school program was watching students who struggled with traditional academics discover they had talent for hands-on work. Kids who'd been labeled as problems or slow learners often excelled when given the chance to work with tools and materials to solve spatial problems and create functional objects. "Everyone has something they're good at," I would tell the teachers who worked with us. Sometimes it just takes the right opportunity to discover what that something is. The support group had grown too, becoming part of a larger network of recovery resources in our city. We trained other facilitators, developed materials that other communities could adapt, and connected with researchers studying the long-term effects of financial crime. Dr. Martinez, who continued to consult with us occasionally, observed that our model combining practical support with creative activities and peer connection was particularly effective for people recovering from betrayal trauma. When someone's trust in the world has been fundamentally shaken, she explained, they need to rebuild not just their finances, but their faith in human connections and their own ability to judge situations accurately. The creative component was crucial because it provided evidence of personal agency and competence. Making something beautiful with your own hands, seeing a project through from conception to completion, offered proof that you could still shape your environment and create value in the world. 12 years after that devastating Tuesday morning, Sarah suggested we write a book about our experience. Not a memoir exactly, but a practical guide for others facing similar challenges. A resource that combined the emotional support aspects of our work with concrete advice about financial recovery and relationship repair. There are books about how to prevent fraud, she pointed out, and books about the psychology of victimization, but not much about the actual process of rebuilding afterward, about how to turn a crisis into an opportunity for growth. Writing the book was more challenging than either of us had anticipated. It required us to revisit painful memories, to analyze our decisions and mistakes with clear eyes, to be honest about our failures as well as our successes. But it also helped us understand our own story more completely, to see the patterns and themes that had shaped our recovery. The book, when it was finally published, struck a chord with readers facing their own crises. Not just financial fraud victims, but people dealing with job loss, divorce, health crises, and other major life disruptions. The principles we'd learned, the importance of community support, the value of creative expression, the possibility of finding meaning in suffering, seemed to apply across different types of trauma. We started traveling to speak at conferences and workshops, sharing our story with audiences of counselors, law enforcement officials, and victim advocates. The response was always the same. People were hungry for examples of genuine recovery, for proof that it was possible to emerge from catastrophic loss stronger and more fulfilled than before. The most dangerous thing about major trauma, I would tell these audiences, is the story it tells you about yourself and your future. Trauma says you're broken, that you'll never be whole again, that the best you can hope for is to manage your damage, but that story is a lie. You can be wounded and still grow. You can lose everything you thought mattered and discover what actually does matter. Emma came to one of our speaking events, traveling from her small town to hear us present at a conference on victim services. Seeing her in the audience, confident and settled, added weight to our message about the possibility of recovery and transformation. After our presentation, she joined us for dinner and shared more about her own work with at-risk youth. The kids she worked with had been written off by schools and families, labeled as troublemakers or lost causes. But in her woodworking program, they discovered capabilities they hadn't known they possessed. It's the same principle you talk about in your presentations, she said. People aren't defined by their worst moments or their biggest failures. Give them the right support and the right opportunities, and they can become something completely different from what anyone expected. The conversation reminded me of something my old woodworking instructor had said about working with damaged lumber. Sometimes the boards with knots and irregularities make the most interesting pieces, he'd told our class. The wood that's been stressed or scarred often has the most character, the most beauty, once you learn how to work with its unique properties. 15 years after the theft, we received our final letter from Emma. She and her husband had adopted 2 siblings, kids who'd been bounced through multiple foster homes and had almost aged out of the system. Emma's letter was filled with stories about helping them adjust to stability, teaching them that adults could be trusted, showing them how to channel their anger and fear into creative projects. I think about the chain of events sometimes, she wrote. How Rick's cruelty led to your sacrifice, which led to my rescue, which led to all the work we've each done since then. None of us would have chosen the path that brought us here, but I can't imagine being anywhere else or being anyone else than who I've become. The letter included photos of her family, clearly happy despite the challenges they faced. The kids were working on woodworking projects, their faces serious with concentration as they learned to use hand tools safely and effectively. They're teaching me as much as I'm teaching them, Emma continued, about resilience, about the possibility of starting over, about the difference between surviving and thriving. They've been through things that would break most adults, but they still have hope, still believe they can build better lives for themselves. Sarah cried when she read the letter, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. She did it, she whispered. She really did it. She took something terrible and turned it into something beautiful. The business continued to grow, but we'd learned to be selective about expansion. We turned down opportunities that would have made us more money, but would have compromised the values that had driven our work from the beginning. Quality over quantity, community over profit, meaning over success as traditionally measured. Our 20th wedding anniversary fell on a Sunday, and we celebrated by working together in the shop, Sarah sketching design ideas while I worked on a commissioned dining table. The easy collaboration felt like a symbol of how far we'd come, how we'd learned to blend our different strengths into something larger than either of us could achieve alone. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I'd told you about Emma from the beginning? Sarah asked, as she watched me plane a difficult piece of wood. Sometimes, I admitted, but I think we needed to go through what we went through. We needed to learn how to trust each other completely, how to communicate about difficult things, how to build something together from nothing. The dining table I was working on was for a young couple, their first major furniture purchase as they furnished their first home together. They'd visited our showroom multiple times, discussing options and possibilities, clearly understanding that they were investing in something that would be part of their lives for decades to come. "That's what I want our work to represent," Sarah said, gesturing toward the half-finished table. "Not just furniture, but the idea that it's possible to build something lasting, something that gets more beautiful with age rather than wearing out." The metaphor applied to more than our business. Our marriage, tested by betrayal and loss, had become stronger and more resilient over time. Our friendship with Emma, interrupted by years of separation and complicated by trauma, had deepened into something unshakable. Even our relationship with money had evolved, becoming more thoughtful and intentional rather than driven by fear or ambition. As I worked on the final details of the dining table, running my hands over surfaces that were smooth and warm to the touch, I thought about Emma's insight regarding identity being about choices rather than history. Every day for the past 15 years, Sarah and I had chosen to see our crisis as an opportunity rather than a catastrophe. We'd chosen to build rather than just recover, to serve others rather than just serve ourselves, to trust rather than retreat into suspicion and fear. Those choices had created the people we'd become and the life we'd built together. Not perfect people or a perfect life, but authentic ones. People who'd been tested and had discovered they could handle more than they'd ever imagined. A life that reflected our values and brought us genuine satisfaction. The sun was setting as I applied the final coat of finish to the dining table, the golden light streaming through our workshop windows, highlighting the grain patterns in the wood. Sarah was cleaning her sketching materials, already planning our next project. Outside, we could hear the sounds of our neighborhood coming home from their weekend activities, the comfortable rhythm of ordinary life. "We made it," Sarah said quietly, looking around our workshop at the evidence of what we'd built together. Not just survived, not just recovered, but actually made it to somewhere better than where we started. I nodded, understanding that she wasn't talking about money or business success or even the recognition our work had received. She was talking about something more fundamental, the sense that our lives had meaning, that our struggles had created something valuable, that the story we'd lived together was worth telling. The theft that had devastated us 20 years earlier had become the catalyst for everything good that had followed. Not because suffering is inherently valuable, but because our response to suffering had revealed capabilities and connections we might never have discovered otherwise. As we locked up the workshop and headed home to our small house, Emma's wooden picture frame tucked under my arm, I realized that the story Rick Valdez had tried to write for us, a story of victims and victimization, of trust betrayed and dreams destroyed, had been completely rewritten. We'd taken his narrative of exploitation and transformed it into our own story of resilience, recovery, and renewal. That night, as Sarah and I sat in our living room reviewing plans for the coming week, I found myself grateful for the journey we'd taken together. Not grateful for the trauma or the loss, but grateful for what we'd discovered about ourselves and each other in the process of rebuilding. My wife had sold $350,000 of my stocks behind my back, and in doing so, she'd given us something far more valuable than financial security. She'd given us the chance to discover who we really were when everything else was stripped away, and to build a life based on that knowledge. It was, I realized, the best investment we'd ever made.